Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. Today, we're going to be discussing what happens once the investigation is over. In particular, we're going to be focusing on things like how to communicate outcomes, managing the return of an alleged perpetrator. We're going to talk about things like restoring team trust and culture following an investigation. We'll also talk a bit about how to ensure conduct doesn't reoccur. And to round it off, we will discuss some practical steps for compliance with the duties on employers around sexual harassment and third-party risk. My name is Gabrielle Lintott. I am a senior associate at CM Murray. We have some excellent speakers lined up for you this morning. Firstly, I'm joined by my two partners at CM Murray, Beth, Hale and Emma Bartlett. Both Emma and Beth have extensive experience when it comes to advising both employers and individuals on all things investigations. We are absolutely delighted this morning to have Bethaney Durkin, Director at Byfield Reputation Counsel, which is a leading strategic communications and PR consultancy practice in London, as well as Dr Nina Burrowes, psychologist, author, activist, and founder of the Consent Collective, which provides education and training around things like consent, trauma, and the prevention of sexual harassment. So thank you for joining this morning. So to set the scene, the investigation has concluded. There's a finding. Now what? What next? Who do you speak with? What do you say? How do you say it? When? All those matters, I think, are fair to say, are just as important as the investigation itself. But Emma, before we ever get to communicating the outcome, I know you have spoken quite a lot about how the way in which the investigation itself is conducted sets the tone for everything that follows. So it would be great if you could speak briefly about what employers should be thinking about at the outset in order to prevent any issues which might arise when it comes to communicating investigation outcomes.
Thanks, Gabrielle, and thank you for setting the scene for us there. Yes, right from the beginning, before you even get to the outcome, the way the investigation has been conducted will lead how the communication following the outcome is delivered. Obviously, you have to think about what to say, how to say it, and who needs to know. But at the outset, you want to ensure that the individual who has been accused of allegations has had support from the outset. So we often think about support for the complainant. Support for the witnesses are really important as well, giving them access to somebody to talk to or otherwise. And support for the individual is the accused person. Have they been given some external support, such as counselling? Quite often EAP is not enough, depending on their level of seniority. But the right to be accompanied, that's really important. And quite often with senior people, they will say, well, I don't want to bring anybody who is my peer into this investigation and disclose to them that I'm subject to these types of allegations. So the more senior someone is, perhaps the organisation might have thought about providing them with a buddy. So identifying somebody who is within their peer group, who they know is able to be objective and treat matters confidentially, and suggest to the accused person that they could have access to a buddy who will be somebody that they can talk to about it, somebody if they want to bring into investigation meetings, and that will then follow through to the outcome, so that they have, again, somebody to talk to or possibly somebody to bring with them. And then the other thing I was thinking about was witnesses, because people that have been party to the investigation, what has been said to them right at the outset. Clearly, they need to know that the matters which they discuss in the investigation have to be kept confidential. But you might want to think about how witnesses are prepared beforehand, that they are unlikely to know what the outcome of the investigation is, so that there isn't that expectation. So it's just managing expectations, really. Yeah, and then prior to the outcome, thinking about the communications for the reason for the person's absence. How long have they been out? Has that been kept under review? And planning, really, before launching into the person being absent. Those are my initial thoughts, anyway.
Thanks, Emma. Nina, thinking about the outcome itself, we tend to think of the outcome as binary. The complaint's either upheld or it isn't. But I suspect you're going to talk about how it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Yeah, that's nice and tidy, isn't it? I think, so yeah, as a psychologist, it's my job, if your job touches on this terrain of sexual harassment, whether that's you're doing investigations, you're managing these situations, you're trying to prevent it from happening, you're trying to offer support, you are in very complex psychological terrain. And if we can understand that terrain and understand the psychology, we are going to navigate it better. And certainly if we step back and understand that, yes, we have these processes, but at the end of the day, we are talking about a human behavior. We're talking about relationships. There are obviously many, many outcomes from a report, from an investigation. There's like a ripple effect. And it can travel further than you may ever know. It's about trust. It's about how you feel about working in your organization. It's whether you feel validated. It's how your colleagues are feeling. It's how they're, the ripple effect's massive, which is, I would say, what can give us hope is if we can do a good job of holding the human element of these situations, this can end up being a relatively positive experience for some of those individuals involved, because they find that their organization can handle this. They can hold the complexity, the vulnerability, the psychological safety is available here. But if we think about the outcomes in terms of like the key individuals, our complainant and our respondent, yeah, obviously for the complainant, the impact is so varied. Everyone's going to have their unique experience. And I've certainly met people where, the outcome in terms of what a panel decides is not necessarily the epicenter of their experience, at whatever direction it goes. And for some people it is, but not for everybody. So we need to kind of be thinking about, yes, we have these processes, but how are we holding these people through it? And also for the responding party, I think an outcome we really need to be sensitive to is, what is that person thinking about their experience if they're staying within the organization? Yes, support, yes, well-being, but also how are they feeling about all of that? Like, are they ruminating? Do they feel a sense of injustice? Like these are the things that we need to be alive to, and not just have the kind of the tidy process and think that that's it, because it really isn't it for the individuals involved and all of us around the outside of that.
Thanks, Nina. Bethaney, turning to you, moving on to once there is an outcome, and the who needs to know. Drawing on your experience, how do you map the stakeholder base and balance competing obligations around who gets told what?
There's always, I think, a tension here for organisations between, there can be kind of a desire towards transparency, thinking about, building trust and reassurance. But then there's that kind of legitimate need to know as well, and protecting the confidentiality and the well-being of the individuals involved, as Emma and Nina were just discussing. So the approach will largely be determined by kind of the nature of the outcome and the event, but in principle, we would want to kind of map the stakeholders to consider across a number of levels, and groups within that with different needs. So obviously there's those directly involved and who need to keep that trust in the process. But once you have something to communicate, there's other layers. So there's those involved with actually delivering that news, managing the process. So it might be HR, team leads, managers, basically people who might face questions, and you want them to be prepared with an appropriate answer and a consistent answer across an organization. That's really important for keeping that trust that something has been well managed, not having kind of gaps where uncertainty can creep in. So there's those kind of delivering the news. there's wider colleagues, and again, that can be a number of layers through the affected kind of team or department. There's leadership levels. You know, in a law firm, for example, the partnership, you might feel they need to have more information than other groups, and then the wider workforce within that. But you also might need to think about external audiences. So regulators, for example, depending on the situation, you might have to consider a potential media response, depending on the circumstances, if there's leak or pressure. So it can be quite a large map that you need to kind of consider and plan for. So in that kind of context, I think balancing that competing sense of obligation is quite difficult. There isn't a one-size-all approach, but the kind of question that we tend to think of for clients who are trying to protect their brands through this, you know, are you managing this in a way that's fair, that's professional, and that's ultimately respectful to your people? And as Emma and Nina just said, that includes the respondent as much as others and their well-being. So often one kind of good way to do this is actually just to be very clear about the confidentiality or restraints that the process requires, because what people really want to see is this being taken seriously and is it being handled properly? So you can convey that without actually breaching those confidentiality obligations, and also by not trying to over communicate or over reassure, which I think can be a temptation.
Yeah, I like that you've touched there, Bethany, around, you know, the need to ensure it's respectful. And Beth, I know you speak a lot about the importance of the actual delivery. You know, how, in your view, should outcomes be communicated to parties? What are some of the common mistakes you see?
Thanks, Gabrielle. So I think the first thing to say is I think Bethaney touched on a really important point there is the sort of transparency around confidentiality. So letting people know early what the limitations are on the confidentiality of a process, that everyone says we want to keep it confidential. What does that mean? What does that mean for your organisation? Who will be told about things? And if people know that from the outset, rather than expecting something which they are then disappointed by, if entire confidentiality is not possible, which it so often isn't. So I think that not over promising on confidentiality and being really transparent about that from the outset really helps the end result be more sort of palatable and more manageable. I think the most common mistake that people make is they think that the end of the outcome is the end of the matter, and they don't really they don't look at what happens next and how they communicate and what they communicate, and they don't plan for that. So my first, like, really think about it, plan it, don't rush it, think about timing, think about how communications are made. Most often, ideally, those should be difficult messages should be delivered in person, if possible. Try not to deliver difficult messages on a Friday, and that sounds stupid, but it's really like delivering something really difficult for someone to hear at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon and sending them off into the weekend by themselves without support is just, you know, sort of obviously a bad idea. If they can be delivered earlier in the week, earlier in the day, so you can make sure that people are all right, whoever's hearing those messages. So whether it's the complainant, whether it's the alleged perpetrator, whether it's any witnesses, any difficult messages, in my view, should never be delivered sort of lasting on a Friday afternoon. Having said that, talk to the people, say, you know, maybe earlier on in the process, say, when would you like to be communicated with? What works for you? It's not always possible to comply with those kinds of requests, but you can talk to people and understand what support they have outside of the workplace and what that might look like. So it's all about planning, transparency, understanding what the impact is on other people. And I think managing expectations about what they're going to receive. So are they just going, is everybody, you know, different parties are going to receive different things, right? So is someone going to get a full copy of the report? Are they going to get a summary of the report? Are they going to get a redacted version? And we've worked on matters where you end up with sort of 5 versions of a report because they, for different stakeholders, different parties who are for whom different parts have to be redacted, and making sure that you keep control of that process so that you're not accidentally, you know, giving the wrong thing to the wrong people. And then I think Bethaney's absolutely right, that respect, thinking about respect for everybody, really, yeah, respect and transparency, I think, really key.
We are going to come on now to talk about managing the return of the alleged perpetrator, because not every investigation ends in dismissal. It's possible that the alleged perpetrator may well return to the workplace. So we want to talk a little bit about that. But Emma, coming to you, before we get to managing the return itself, there's that question of how the alleged perpetrator's absence from the workplace has been managed during the investigation. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Thank you. Yes. So right at the outset, when somebody's been, when the investigation first starts, the question arises, do you automatically suspend somebody? And obviously suspension should never be automatic. It should always be a step that is used in a way that allows an investigation to proceed without being hampered by the individual's presence or their interaction with witnesses, or if you think the individual is likely to cause damage to the business. So suspension is not always the first port of call, but if you recognise that the individual may be difficult to have that individual in the workplace when you're trying to encourage witnesses to speak to the investigation, and there is a risk that the individuals could be intimidated, then there are alternatives, obviously, to suspension. One is agreed paid leave, and a lot of employers are cautious not to use that because obviously they're paying somebody not to do anything. It's the same situation as a suspension, except that for the individual, the accused person, they may feel that it's less of a disciplinary action. And so often agreed paid leave is something which can be utilised. But in respect of both suspension and agreed paid leave, you do have to keep it under review, so that obviously the longer somebody is out of the workplace, the harder it is to then bring them back at the end. So whatever you put in place to start off with, you have to think about, firstly, how long that's going to continue for and how that could impact somebody's return to work. And in either case, that sort of leave should be kept to the minimum, kept short. The alternative, there is a third alternative, is that somebody works from home. We're all used to working from home if you're office-based now. So most people are set up for it, but you have to think about, what about meetings, internal meetings, virtual meetings, external meetings? So if somebody's a lawyer and they've got a court hearing, they're going to have, during the period that they're supposed to be just working from home, do they attend court? Because what if juniors are going to be, or other people are going to be attending? You don't want somebody to just turn up for an internal meeting or a meeting in the office where their clients are attending without thinking about the fact that that person is going to come into contact with other people, and that's what you were trying to avoid during the investigation. So there are grades of working from home. Ideally, if you really don't want somebody to come into contact with members of staff, you would have to say no internal, external meetings, and in very rare circumstances would you want them to be attending external meetings if other people from the office are going to be there. But the messaging about that person's absence from the workplace in whatever of those three scenarios that we've just talked about is really important. So quite often when people are suspended or put on a period of paid leave and you're asking them not to communicate with their colleagues, the first thought from colleagues might be that that person is very unwell. And so, and the individual who has been placed on suspension or paid leave will want to make sure that their colleagues know that they're okay. So there is that tension there as well. So you have to think about the messaging as to how you communicate the fact that somebody's not going to be around for a little bit. But anyway, those are my initial thoughts.
No, that's really helpful. Thanks, Emma. When someone does return, Beth, so dismissal's not the outcome, what do you think a well-structured reintegration might look like in practice?
I'm going to sound a little bit like a stuck record, because again, I'm going to say you really need to plan for it. Don't rush into it. Think about not just the people affected by the immediate by the immediate issue, but think more broadly about the whole organisation and also about external stakeholders and how and the company's reputation, the employer's reputation, and how that impacts on everybody. So really thinking, sort of getting buy-in from, to the extent you're able to, from everybody, on the thinking about what conditions you might place on someone's return, thinking about relationships that might need rebuilding. So is an apology something you can, and a sort of perhaps a facilitated apology, some kind of workplace mediation, is that something you can work on either between the people directly affected or more broadly? Training, sort of think about what's happened to the team during the absence, what shifts there have been in the team, and I just come back briefly to the sort of guardrails. What are the kind of conditions of return? Thinking about sort of appropriate protections for everybody and for people in the workplace. And I think we've talked when we're planning this session around what if the guardrails have to be too high, perhaps a return is not an appropriate response. And I think I talk quite often about the fact that on Russell Brand's TV shows, apparently, the approach that some was sometimes taken was that they just wouldn't have female runners. That's allegedly. I don't want to be don't sue me. But I think that it's that kind of thing that's if what you're having to do is totally change the workplace to facilitate someone's return, then probably a return is not the appropriate response. So yeah, I think that there is real planning to do and real thought to be done. Of course, dismissal is not always the necessary appropriate response, but if it isn't, you really have to think hard about what the return looks like and how you manage the workplace and how you manage those team dynamics, which will inevitably, whatever the findings that have been made in an investigation, those team dynamics will have shifted. They will have been sort of ruptured by the event of whatever has happened, and it's really important that you think hard about how you manage that.
Bethaney, I suspect you're going to say the same around the need to plan, but what can go wrong when the return isn't managed appropriately, particularly thinking from a communications and reputational perspective?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think fundamentally when it goes wrong, it erodes the trust that your people have in the organisation. They won't feel that something has been managed sort of properly. And that can really cut to the heart of the sense of the culture and your values and that feeling of safety. So, because ultimately we are judged more by actions than words, and this is a very kind of physical representation of that. I mean, I think from where we've seen difficult challenges arise, a lot of the pitfalls actually can arise in the way the absence is kind of introduced, as Emma was describing. I've seen one difficult case. It was a law firm where an individual was suspended for about 4 months without pay following misconduct, but that wasn't widely known. So there was this kind of assumption that built that they'd been on some kind of relaxing like sabbatical, at their second home, whatever. And when that return date kind of became close, there was a bit of a feeling of horror among the people who had been involved in the investigation, that the idea that this person would kind of waltz back in a bit unhumbled. So that was quite difficult to manage in terms of reassuring them that no, it has been taken seriously, like the appropriate action was taken. But obviously you can't really go into the detail of that action because, particularly in this case, actually, there were quite harsh restrictions around confidentiality, because I think they were employed out of Spain, which was very, very strict on confidentiality. So it was actually really difficult to manage. And because there'd been that kind of vacuum at the start, assumptions had come in, and it's harder to kind of row back once they're established. So yeah, I think kind of exactly as Beth was saying, planning from the start is really important, because it can be much harder at the sort of end of that suspension when the return arises, if there's already preconceptions that you have to maybe try and unpick.
Thanks, Bethaney. We're going to come on now to talk about restoring team culture and trust, because beyond the parties directly involved in an investigation, there's of course the wider team. It's the people who might have suspected something was going wrong, or something was going on rather. They might have covered people's work. They might have seen a colleague, disappear from work and never return, or they do return. So restoring trust in a team and an organisation following an investigation is going to be really important. So Nina, I'm going to come to you first on this. Employers, I think, they may want to facilitate some kind of apology or hold some form of mediation, because that feels perhaps like the right thing to do in some cases. But I know you have asked a more important question around, well, who is that actually beneficial to? Who are we doing that for? Do you want to explore that tension a little bit more?
Yeah, I think wouldn't it be nice to draw a line under the issue? Like, isn't that what people are often wanting to do? They're wanting to move on, assign this to the past, like get back on it. And, you know, maybe the particular incident you're talking about, that's perfectly possible. But maybe it isn't for everybody involved. And I think it's really important to recognize how much power you have as an organization, and you know, to recognize that you might want this to be now tidied up. But if that's not how the complainant is feeling, if that's not how witnesses are feeling, then you shouldn't be forcing that issue. Perhaps the complainant doesn't want an apology. Like, you know, if they want to sit there and feel rage and never, you know, not give the responding party, you know, the opportunity to apologize, then that's fine, and that should be accommodated too. I think sometimes we just want it all to be tidy, and we think that somebody apologizing to somebody else is always the solution. And certainly if that apology isn't real, then it's actually another insult. And we have to remember with these individuals that in terms of their behavior, like grooming and manipulation is part of the package of their behavior dynamics. And so, you know, I think we owe it to complainants to allow them to drive certainly any apology, and checking in. I think also as well, whether somebody's come to terms with what they've done. There's a lot of denial and resistance around these accusations, which is an incredibly human thing. I don't know that we should be necessarily expecting people to really genuinely have come to terms with the fact that they've caused harm. There are things that we can do to facilitate that, skills and the rest of it. But if we think about the wider culture, another really useful question to be asking amongst the wider teams is actually, could this situation have been spotted and dealt with before it escalated to whatever we are now subsequently investigating? Because that is the culture of you know, part of the culture of the organization. So when we're thinking about reintegration and culture afterwards, and we're thinking about training, we can also be thinking about, okay, does this particular team or the organization need more skills, more empowerment, so that we don't have open secrets here, or situations where people notice something but they don't say anything and they don't do anything? Because if they had, maybe we wouldn't have had this whole situation in the beginning. So I'm a huge fan of prevention. So much harder to kind of fix a culture once it's been ruptured. But the best way to fix a ruptured culture is not to insist on it being tidy, but to be willing to sit in the mess if a mess is what you have.
I mean, that's so interesting, talking about that sort of rupture and sitting in a mess. I think one of the things that I was going to talk about was that sort of the team more broadly. So not necessarily the people directly involved in the matter, but sort of how do you pick up the pieces where everybody has seen this thing, or sort of peripherally, or heard gossip, and there's a sort of, so, you know, we always talk about trying to stop office gossip, but I think that is basically impossible. People will have talked, people will have speculated, people will have made up their mind about what has happened and who is in the right and who is in the wrong. And as you say, I think there's that sort of temptation to really try and tidy that and go, you know, there's a bad guy and there's a good guy, and that's the end of the, end of the story. But so I think just thinking about what has happened in the team during the period, any period of absence, whoever has been absent, if anyone has, thinking about how you let those people who have been speculating, reaching their own conclusions, how you allow them to feel in some way heard, and to not just close down those discussions, because I don't think that's necessarily helpful just to say you're not allowed to talk about this. Although often, you know, during the investigation, that's really important that you try and limit that. But I think after the event, it's impossible to do. So sort of giving people an opportunity to ask questions. There may be questions that you can't answer. There may be questions that you have to say, we can't talk about that because It is to do with, hi Gabrielle, it is, it's confidential. There are data protection issues. There are issues around, who is allowed to know what, but being honest with people and sort of demonstrating that when you talk about a speak up culture, you mean that people can speak up and they can come to whoever it is in the organisation with questions, and they will be listened to, and those questions will be answered where it's possible to do so. You can't, I think that's sort of, again, transparency, but they need to understand that a proper process has been followed, and that's a really important message to convey, I think. So we were then going to move on to sort of limiting the risk of recurrence. How do you ensure that a conduct doesn't recur? So thinking about how an organisation can learn from an investigation, what risks it's been carrying, what needs to change. And I think that is true. Those learnings, those lessons are really true, whether the alleged perpetrator leaves or remains in post. And Nina, I think it would be great if you could talk about the broader organisational learning that should come from when you've done an investigation well. What sort of questions should the employer be asking themselves, and what patterns of risk should they be looking for if you're thinking about learnings?
Yeah, I think it's important to think beyond just the individuals involved. So has this situation brought to your attention a new type of risk, a new dynamic, a lack of training, as I've mentioned? Prevention has got to be the ultimate goal for all of this. Like the ideal isn't, I like really good investigations, but the ideal is we don't need to have the investigation because we prevented it from happening. So like looking at it from that lens, if we have hindsight, what might we have done as an organisation, as colleagues, as a culture, as a community to notice this earlier, to prevent it from happening? What additional training, not just does this individual maybe need, and they might need some in terms of skills and awareness and self-awareness, like having integrity, being able to hold the fact that you've caused harm is quite a high level of emotional intelligence involved in that. But yeah, also thinking of just like those wider risks, and just being like creative, not just when we have the investigative process is quite a rigid process. But then I think the challenge is then after that we need to be super creative and flexible, because we need to be curious about what might we do in the future to prevent this from happening. And absolutely, for me, like skills training is a huge part of what we do. Like so many people who work for you now, they don't want to work in a place where there is sexual harassment, but if they become aware of something, they are afraid of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, and making the situation worse. So they're holding themselves back. And you need to create a culture where it feels safe for them to say something, to do something, to let somebody else know about it, to have the interpersonal skills so that we can catch these situations before they escalate. I think we have lots of investigations because we always tell people to report. Like that's the one call to action, and like that's unrealistic and it's way too late. Like we need more. So that needs to be part of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about prevention.
Thank you, Nina. In a similar vein, Emma, when someone remains in the workplace, that might be, with a warning or under a review period, can you talk a bit about who needs to be brought into that outcome? What should those people be told? Managing at the same time confidentiality obligations.
So if you have a situation where a line manager or somebody who's supervising the individual who's returned after an outcome, and assuming that the individual is subject to a disciplinary warning that's live for a period of time, if their line manager or supervisor and possibly their head of a department don't know about that fact, then there is the risk, in my view, that the conduct could be repeated, but then not treated properly. So I'm not advocating that a broad group of people should know about the fact of a disciplinary warning or an outcome, but those who need to know should be aware of it. And if there's a change in line manager or head of department, then they should be brought up to speed. and it's only for the life of the disciplinary warning. But say, for example, the conduct recurs again, and then the line manager treats it very informally and doesn't recognise that there is a pattern of behaviour here which needs to be addressed in quite a different way had they known about the fact of the investigation and the outcome. You would hope that a line manager, before if an issue is comes to their attention regarding an individual, might speak to HR if they have the benefit of a people team to say, this is what I'm proposing to do in relation to this issue that's cropped up. What do you think? And then obviously HR should be aware that there's a live warning on file and would be able to recognise a pattern of conduct and maybe think that a slightly more formal approach or a different approach is required. But in my view, it's not a broad number of people that need to know about the outcome, but there are some people who do need to know about the outcome in order to ensure that any, using Beth's term, of guardrails that have been put in place are observed. And I think that's really important.
Thanks, Emma. Bethaney, I know during some of our discussions you talked a little bit about the importance of things like bystander training. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think I'd kind of build on what Emma was just saying about kind of making sure that the appropriate tools are in place, because really from the kind of communications perspective, if there were to be a recurrence and a company were to face questions, maybe it's through a context of a regulatory investigation, for example, and they had to kind of defend the decisions that they'd taken. Could you defend this is always the question. And, what would you say to your people if, say, for example, there was a repeat, I'll use the law firm example again, and an associate who'd been working late with that individual, say, for example, just them in the office, they might be actually really alarmed that, you let me do that, and you knew there was a potential risk there. So kind of being aware that there is this kind of untapped risk and kind of uncontrolled risk is really important, and kind of guiding your decisions around it. So making sure that there is that wider tool set of, exactly as Emma says, being able to pick up on potential patterns, but also if there's individuals on the spot who might need to intervene, bystander training can be really helpful. And that doesn't have to be pick out key individuals. It can be for whole teams. You don't have to signal that something has happened to trigger this training, but just making sure that those skills are kind of embedded can be really helpful. The general kind of crisis management perspective is always around, don't hope for the best, kind of plan for the worst, put the measures in place, do your scenario planning, and then, hey, hope you never need it. I think that would be what we would kind of think about when talking about how do we try and encourage this conduct not to reoccur.
Beth, do you have anything to add around the tools that employers might be thinking about in order to allow individuals to challenge behaviour if it is perhaps continuing or re-emerges?
Yeah, I think giving people really practical tools, and I know Nina's going to come on to that at the end, sort of what training looks like and how you train people, but giving people not just saying, yeah, feel free to come and speak to us, but saying, let's talk about how you do that, what you say if something arises, how you practically call out behaviour that is not acceptable. And I think really thinking around that practical, and not saying this is the only way to do it, but saying, here are some ways you might do it. Let's talk about what you have found has worked in the past, and sort of really encouraging people to be prepared with real practical ways of calling out sort of, as I say, unacceptable behaviour. Don't know if Nina, if you want to add something now.
Yeah, I think it's a skill, like giving and receiving feedback. You can give. I mean, I'm sure we've all been on the receiving end of unskillful feedback, and it's hard to take it on board and therefore change your behaviour. So there is a skillful way to have these conversations. And I think it's not enough to say to people, just say something. Like, you literally need to practice the words that you are going to use to start this conversation and actually also finish this conversation and understand what the conversation needs to be about. And all of that is a skill set that can be taught. And when it's taught, it needs to be practiced. And when it's practiced, it needs to be practiced in an environment where it's psychologically safe to do so, because I want to be able to step in and actually make those mistakes. And maybe I did mishear the situation. So that means, the way in which I'm going to step in needs to be curious rather than confrontational. All of these kinds of things, we need people to know that just the very nature of sexual harassment. It's happening in our cultures. It's there, and if we can be alert to it, if we can intervene. And you know what, that intervention is, for me, it's never an invitation to police your colleagues and start calling them out and telling them that they are sexual harassers. It's actually incredibly generous feedback to give somebody, because we are not experts on how we are impacting other people in our work environment. We might think that we are incredibly charming or funny, or this is us being friendly, or I've been behaving like this for 15 years. Surely somebody would have told me. And it's like, actually, no one was that generous. So I think we can help people understand that, this is an investment in workplace relationships. It's how we create safe environments. And always keeping in mind like those worst case scenarios where someone actually is abusing their power, causing a great deal of harm. We need that psychologically safe culture, because we want that person on the receiving end to feel that they can report here and that their colleagues will handle it well, and that the organisation will as well. So currently, culture is used by sexual harassers to their advantage, to hide, to have it laughed off, downplayed, blame the complainant. We need to completely reverse that and create cultures where it's spotted, a conversation is had, people are held to account, whether they, can see the impact of what they've done or not, and it's managed in whatever way is appropriate for that situation.
I love what you say about sort of it being generous to give that feedback. I think what's one of the things that's really important is we often train people, we talk about giving feedback, giving challenging behaviour that is not acceptable, raising concerns. But what we don't talk about nearly enough, I think, is how you receive those concerns. And people also need to understand, as you say, that a challenge to your behaviour isn't a challenge to you. It's not a sort of, doesn't necessarily go to the heart of who you are. And we all need to be better at receiving feedback, actually. And I think that, that plays out in a lot of scenarios, doesn't it? But I think that actually, if someone says to you, do you know what, actually, I think that wasn't an all right thing to say, instead of getting very defensive about it, people, everyone needs to sort of learn to take a step back and go, okay, I should listen to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for educating me, or whatever it might be. There may be moments in which that's totally, you don't agree with the feedback, but don't. I think in that moment, just taking a step back and going, okay, good to know.
But that can only happen in an environment where we have that level of nuance around this topic area, where we understand that there's a spectrum of behaviours, that not everybody who is accused is the kind of predatory kind of harasser. Some people are like, we need to have the nuance. And if you don't have a workplace culture where nuance exists on this topic area, then it will be just silence, report, investigation, bit of a mess, silence again, report, investigation, a bit of a mess. And we need to change that.
Yeah, and I think that allowing for mistakes in the workplace, in the same way, I talk to my kids about everyone can make mistakes. You've got to allow for that. You've got to be forgiving, but explain to people why it was a mistake, why that wasn't okay. And I think it's exactly the same message in the workplace. That that's not, as you say, not everything is a really super serious act, and sort of speaking to each other about the lesser things is really, really important.
Obviously, all of those things you've both just spoken about are, things that employers should be thinking about at the moment, where they have the duties around, the prevention of sexual harassment and also third-party risk as well. So I want to come on to talking about that. Emma, risk assessments. I think employers probably understand those in the context of health and safety, particularly, post-COVID and things like that, but maybe less so in the harassment context. So in your view, how should employers be approaching risk assessments, and without it being just, a tick box exercise, what should they be turning their minds to in light of these new duties?
Yes, I mean, risk assessments are a principle, first line of defense, isn't it? To make sure that you've got this is how we ensure that the unwelcome conduct or behaviour doesn't happen, is that we approach each situation and make sure we understand the risks, and then we can put in place the guardrails that we need to protect people. And so with the recent change in the law with regards to the increased obligation on employers to prevent workplace harassment, currently sexual harassment, it's looking at the different environments and approaching it sensibly. So an office environment, the likely incidence of harassment might actually be quite low. But when individuals are at different events, whether that's an evening event at their own office or at a bar nearby, or whether it's a client event, an offsite, or an industry event, whether that's in the country or outside of the country, are they going to be on their own at that event? Will there be alcohol? Are there any known risks at these events? So if somebody is going to a client and the client is particularly known to be obnoxious or offensive, then all of this should feed into your risk assessment. But the one thing that needs to be fed into risk assessment is updates. So where you have just investigated an incident, there has been an outcome, the individual has returned to work, that needs to feed into your risk assessment as to, it's not always alcohol that is to blame, or the fact that there's no senior people or only one senior person at this event. It's looking at it critically, knowing that an incident happened and therefore it increases the risk. It's a little bit like, speed cameras. Speed cameras only appear on roads where there has been an accident. So if there's been an incident, you need to increase the protection that you put in place, which is why the speed camera is there. And it's the same thing with your risk assessment. So keeping them updated and keeping some central record so that you can critically assess risk in the workplace and outside of the workplace where your employees are going to be.
I like that analogy, Emma. Bethaney, with drawing on your experience, having advised lots of different organisations, are there any things you think employers should be doing that they perhaps may not be?
I think just having a bit more of a slightly cynical lens over some of these things would help some companies. It's particularly, as Emma said, it's often not in the office, it's when you're in another location. So the kind of company away day or retreat is the classic example where this kind of thing can happen. And the tendency is to effectively hope for the best. Think we have a good culture, we have great people, obviously nothing like this will happen here. And then when there is an incident and you kind of have to then sort of defend the decisions and say, do you have a good answer for why did you have a completely open bar tab? And, it was an overnight stay, and had you thought about the risk of this kind of thing happening? It can be quite difficult. So doing that thinking up front, as kind of unpleasant as it might feel, doing that kind of worst case scenario planning, thinking about actually, do we have, say, sober chaperones in place? Do we have people who are senior who are appointed to keep an eye on things and make sure they're being responsible? Just having that kind of risk lens overlaid on a company activity, particularly where it's a bit outside the usual day-to-day, would be kind of what we'd recommend, and sort of think about, if we did have to explain the decisions we took to someone, what would that explanation be? Does this sound reasonable? Because I think that is the test, isn't it? It's about whether this was reasonable. It's not you can't ever guarantee complete prevention, but you can take reasonable measures, and that's something you have to do kind of with intent. So being a bit more proactive about it.
And Beth, what are your thoughts around, some sticking with the, practical tips and how employers might comply with this duty?
Yeah, so I think the risk assessment is obviously key, but also beyond, you can't just do a risk assessment and then kind of file it away and move on with your life. As Emma says, it's a kind of live document, but also just sort of thinking about how people, what people's experiences are when they're, for example, at events, and that when they're out on business doing this stuff, that ensure that people know that they have a way out, that they will be supported if they do call out behaviour. Tell people they don't have to stay at events. It might be, that sort of, I think the sort of classic networking event might be part of people's jobs, but they don't have to stay, they don't have to drink, they don't have to go to after parties, all of those kinds of things. So sort of making sure that people know they have options, making sure that people know who they can contact if they're in a difficult situation, having someone who they can contact at any time of the day or night. I think especially if there are overnight stays, is really important, and just letting people know that you will support them in any and that you will provide them with a way out. So, for example, you can get a taxi any time of night. Don't worry about the cost, that kind of stuff. Just making sure that people know that they have an easy way out.
And finally, coming to you, Nina, I think you've spoken with us a bit about what genuinely empowering training in the workplace might look like. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that and any other steps you think employers should be taking?
I have so much to say about the prevention of sexual harassment. I have literally written a book about it. So there's loads you can do. I think when we're thinking about empowerment as well, and we're thinking about third party, we can be thinking about individuals on the receiving end of potential sexual harassment, telling them they can report when we know that 80% of people don't choose to report is not good enough. So what else can they do? What can they do in the moment? What skills might they need? It is never your fault if you're on the receiving end of sexual harassment. However, if you were my niece, I would sit down and I'd say, well, there's 6 things you might try in the moment. So we should be empowering people. If we know there's a conference or an event that is always high risk, what conversations are we going to have as a team before we go in there? How do people feel about going into this environment? Like, these are the things we need to start doing. If you are interested in the book at all, I've got a coupon code there, which is valid until the end of October, and it is the word prepared, lowercase, as is your opportunity to be prepared. That also runs out at the end of October. So do help yourself to that if you want a lot more on this.
I think that brings us to the end of our topics, but we do have one question in the chat, which I will put to you all. It's to do with alcohol. In my investigations, on many occasions where harassment takes place at work-related events, often misconduct was committed because of too much drinking, which we know is often common. But it's so difficult to change behaviour or ban drinking, despite it being a clear risk factor. Any thoughts?
Just to say, absolutely, that alcohol is involved in so many incidents of sexual harassment in the workplace that, honestly, with my lawyer's hat on, with my employment lawyer's hat on, I would say don't allow people to drink at work events. But I totally recognise that is impractical. And actually, in some, we've worked with employers where they've, for example, gone from always having an open bar at the Christmas party to drinks tokens and allowing people really limited drinks, and it has been really badly received by people who feel I've worked hard and this is part of the what I've worked hard for is to now be allowed to let loose at the Christmas party or whatever event it might be. But I think that there are a number. I don't think there's an absolute solution, because I think individual behaviour around alcohol is, as you say, Rachel, really, really hard to manage. But I think that you can manage it, change gradually with messaging around the workplace's attitude to alcohol. You can manage it in terms of how leaders talk about alcohol, how people talk, how leaders conduct themselves at work events, and and by leading by example on that. And you can manage, and this sounds like a sort of cliche, but for lots of reasons, not just sexual harassment ones, but for lots of reasons, having events where alcohol is not the key focus is really, really important. So sort of thinking a bit more creatively about how you socialise with your colleagues.
I'm going to add to that. I think if you're banning alcohol, or if your HR team are hiding from the Christmas party because they don't want to go because they won't be able to relax, those are both signs that you haven't done the work to, we've talked about trust. You should be able to trust your people to have a drink and not end up sexually harassing each other. And so more training, including training on alcohol. And I know we're really running out of time, and just aware that there's a lot to this work. We're holding a training that is just about working with respondents, a whole day where we can talk about well-being, but also the rehabilitation side of this. How do we support somebody to not do that again? So if that's of interest, just want you to be aware of that.
I'm not going to add. I think Beth and Nina have said it all. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much out of time. There is one more question which we could do a quick 30-second answer to, perhaps. That won't be possible, but so it's to do with policies stating that they have a zero tolerance for any retaliation. Yet very rarely do I see organisations take disciplinary action against staff accused of detrimental treatment. The question is to do with legal barriers to this from an employer perspective.
So I'll take this very quickly in 30 seconds. Saying you've got a zero tolerance policy to retaliation would mean that the individual, you would have to establish that the conduct which is alleged to be retaliation is exactly that, is retaliation for the person either raising a complaint or supporting somebody in raising a complaint. And quite often that can be a difficult thing to establish. But once it is established, if you've got a zero tolerance to it, then you have to act upon it. And if some organisation recognises they can't act on it, but what do they mean by zero tolerance? Because that doesn't mean that if you retaliate against somebody, you're out of the organisation. It might just mean that you will have an outcome. There will be an investigation, there will be an outcome, but it might not be dismissal. But people do need to react to retaliation. And the principal reason I say that is because quite often, from putting my advisor hat on, people will make allegations of unlawful discrimination or harassment. And actually that allegation may not be well founded or sustained within the organisation, but they will have a successful claim for victimisation if the people within the organisation against whom the complaint has been made can't react professionally in relation to that. And therefore you hand somebody a complaint of victimisation, which will be successful, even if the underlying complaint was not well made out. So organisations, at the end of the day, just have to police everything.
Thanks, Emma. Before we wrap up, I'm going to go to each of you and just in one line, what's one key takeaway you want people to walk away from this discussion with? I'll start with you, Nina.
I think probably some of the worst days of your job and some of the best days are about this human bit. It's about the stickiness of the human rupture of relationships and the person and the emotions. And so I think today, even the fact that we're having the conversation shows how useful it could be to be able to navigate all of that with more care, more knowledge, more options. And so, yeah, I hope today, the words we've been using is like trust and skills and like, this is the path forward. And I hope that you and your teams have got that. And when you do, that's when you get to have like the best days of those moments where you know you've supported someone. Like that feeling is awesome. Like being able to really show up for people in this space for this topic area is such a privilege. So we want more of that and less of these situations where we're like, I don't know, there's 1,000 emotions flying around the room and I don't actually know what to do in this moment. Let's equip people so they feel that they can hold all of it, because it's a lot that we're asking people to do.
And Bethaney.
I think I'd close on that, people, they won't just judge the company on kind of what happened, but really on what you did next. And it is seen as a test of how well you kind of live your culture and your values, and you can really actually reinforce that in this context. You can really build a lot of trust and earn a good reputation, because people don't expect things never to go wrong, but they do expect you to respond well when they do. And if you can build that factor, that's probably the biggest feeling and how well you can move on from an investigation. It's about responding well, and that's what really builds trust.
Thanks, Bethaney. And to Beth.
I'm going to keep it really short. I think plan, don't leave things to chance. Plan from the beginning and be transparent where you can be.
Perfect. Emma?
Preparation and planning and transparency. I was going to say exactly the same as Beth.
All right. I think that is all we have time for today, but thank you so much to everyone who tuned in this morning. Thank you in particular to Bethaney and Nina for joining us, and to Beth and Emma. It's such an important discussion, and I hope everyone continues to engage in this discussion and to really give further thought to it. Of course, should you require legal advice in this area or simply want to continue the discussion, please do reach out to a member of the CMRE team and Nina and Bethaney. But otherwise, enjoy the hot day, and thank you all for joining.